Something happened in August 1969 that literally changed how America saw itself. And no, this isn't another one of those true crime videos where I'm going to romanticize serial killers or whatever. This is different. This is about how one night, one absolutely insane night in Los Angeles, basically killed the entire 1960s vibe. Like, just murdered it dead. And here's the thing that's going to piss you off. Almost everything you think you know about this case? Probably wrong. Or at least, incomplete. Because this story has been told so many times, turned into so many movies and documentaries and podcasts, that the actual facts have gotten buried under layers of Hollywood mythology and oversimplified narratives about hippies gone bad or whatever. So forget what you've heard. Seriously, just put it aside for a minute. August 8th, 1969. 10,050 Cielo Drive, Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles. Beautiful house, secluded, expensive. The kind of place where successful people live when they've made it. And that night, 5 people were inside. 5 people who have no idea that in a few hours, they're going to become part of one of the most infamous crimes in American history. But we're not starting there. Because if we start there, you won't understand why this happened. And the why is so much stranger than you're expecting. Okay, so it's the summer of '69, right? Woodstock is about to happen. The Vietnam War is raging. The civil rights movement is in full swing. And in California, specifically, there's this whole counterculture thing happening. Communes, free love, people dropping out of society, experimenting with drugs, questioning authority. You know the story. Now, most people, when they think about the '60s, they have this nostalgic, rose-tinted view of it all. Peace and love and flower power and all that stuff. And sure, that existed. But there was also this darker undercurrent that nobody really wants to talk about. This sense that things were spiraling, that the optimism of the early '60s had curdled into something else, something unstable and kind of dangerous. And right in the middle of all this, you've got Charles Manson. And here's where I'm going to frustrate you right away. Manson didn't actually kill anyone that night. Not personally. He wasn't even at the scene. So when you hear Manson family murders, understand that the actual dynamics of what happened are way more complicated than crazy cult leader goes on killing spree. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Sharon Tate, because she deserves more than just being remembered as a victim. She was 26 years old in August 1969. 26. She was an actress. She was beautiful, yeah, but she was also, by all accounts, genuinely kind. Not Hollywood fake kind, actually kind. People loved her. She'd been in a few movies, most notably Valley of the Dolls a couple years earlier, and she was married to Roman Polanski, the director. You might know him from Rosemary's Baby, which had come out just the year before and had been this massive hit. So they're this golden couple, right? Young, talented, successful, living in this beautiful house in the hills. Oh, and Sharon was 8.5 months pregnant. 8.5 months. Keep that in mind, because when I tell you what happened, you're going to feel physically sick. I'm warning you now. But that night, August 8th, Polanski wasn't even in Los Angeles. He was in London working on a film. So Sharon was at the house with some friends. Jay Sebring, who was a celebrity hairstylist, and actually Sharon's ex-boyfriend. But they'd stayed close friends. Wojciech Frykowski, who was a friend of Polanski's. Abigail Folger, yes, from the Folger coffee family, who was Frykowski's girlfriend. And then there was Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old kid who was just visiting the property's caretaker and happened to be in the wrong place at the worst possible time. 5 people, just hanging out, talking, living their lives, completely unaware. All right, so who were the people who did this? Because this is where it gets really disturbing, and not in the way you might expect. Well, Charles Manson was born in 1934 to a teenage mother who didn't want him. He spent most of his childhood and adolescence in and out of juvenile detention centers and prisons. By the time he got out of prison in 1967, at age 32, he'd spent more than half his life institutionalized. He actually asked prison officials if he could stay because the outside world scared him. They said no. And here's what's crazy. When he got out, he went to San Francisco, right into the heart of the hippie movement. And this guy, this career criminal who'd been in prison for most of his life, he just adapted. He grew his hair out, learned to play guitar, started talking about peace and love and Eastern philosophy. But underneath all that, he was something else entirely. He was a con man, a manipulator, and he was really good at finding vulnerable people. By 1969, he'd gathered around him this group of mostly young women. The Manson family, they'd later be called. They lived on an old movie ranch outside L.A. called Spahn Ranch. And these weren't stupid people, okay? That's what's so frustrating about how this story gets told. They weren't all brainwashed idiots. They were runaways, sure, some of them. Products of broken homes, abuse, neglect. But they were also seekers, people looking for meaning, for family, for something to believe in. And Manson gave them that, or at least he gave them the illusion of it. He used drugs, specifically LSD, but also manipulation tactics that would make a psychology textbook. He love-bombed them, isolated them, broke down their sense of self, rebuilt them in his image. Classic cult leader stuff. But he was particularly skilled at it. And he had this whole apocalyptic philosophy he'd cobbled together from the Bible, Beatles songs, Scientology, and his own paranoid delusions. He called it Helter Skelter, after the Beatles song. He believed there was going to be a race war, and that black people were going to rise up and kill all the white people, except for Manson and his family, who would hide out in a cave in Death Valley until it was all over. And then they'd emerge and rule the world, because black people, according to Manson's incredibly racist worldview, wouldn't know how to govern themselves. I told you, this was going to be stranger than you expected. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but how do you get from that insane philosophy to murdering a pregnant actress and her friends? And that's the question, isn't it? That's what we need to understand. By the summer of '69, things at Spahn Ranch were getting weird. Manson was becoming increasingly paranoid and violent. The family had been involved in some smaller crimes, drug burns, stealing cars, that kind of thing. But Manson was escalating. He was also obsessed with the music industry. See, he thought he was going to be a rock star. He'd actually been trying to get a record deal and had even made some connections in the music world. Terry Melcher, Doris Day's son, who was a music producer, had come out to Spahn Ranch to hear Manson play, and Melcher had ultimately passed on signing him. This rejection ate at Manson. And here's a detail that's going to become important. Terry Melcher used to live at 10,050 Cielo Drive, the same house Sharon Tate was living in now. See, but Manson knew Melcher had moved. So this wasn't about going to kill Terry Melcher. That's a misconception. This was about something else, something darker and more random. Manson started talking to his followers about Helter Skelter, about how they needed to trigger the race war themselves since it wasn't happening fast enough naturally. His plan was to kill white people and make it look like black people did it, to start the uprising. It's insane. It's completely insane. But to his followers, who'd been isolated and indoctrinated and dosed with LSD for months or years, it made sense. Or at least, they'd been conditioned not to question it. On the night of August 8th, Manson apparently told several of his followers to go to that house where Terry Melcher used to live and totally destroy everyone in it, as gruesome as you can. The people he sent: Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. Watson was 23, basically Manson's right-hand man. Atkins was 21. Krenwinkel was 21. Kasabian was 20. Kids. They were essentially kids. Kasabian was the newest member of the family, and had only been there a few weeks. And that night, she drove the car but didn't participate in the murders. She later became the prosecution's star witness. They drove to Cielo Drive. They cut the phone lines. Stephen Parent, that 18-year-old kid I mentioned earlier, was just leaving the property in his car when they shot him 4 times. He was the first to die, just because he was there. Then they went into the house. I'm going to tell you what happened, but I'm not going to be graphic about it. Not because I'm squeamish, but because these were real people, and what happened to them was horrific enough without me turning it into torture porn for views. Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Wojciech Frykowski, and Abigail Folger were all murdered. The methods were brutal, violent, frenzied. The attackers used knives and guns. There was no mercy shown. Sebring tried to protect Sharon and was shot and stabbed. Frykowski and Folger tried to escape and were hunted down outside the house and killed on the lawn. Sharon Tate, 8.5 months pregnant, begged for her life. Begged for the life of her baby. Susan Atkins later claimed she told Sharon, "Look, bitch, I don't care about you. I don't care if you're going to have a baby. You're going to die, and I don't feel anything about it." They stabbed her 16 times. Her baby died with her. After they were done, they wrote "pig" on the front door in Sharon Tate's blood. Then they went back to Spahn Ranch, changed clothes, and apparently Manson was unhappy with how the whole thing had gone down because it had been too messy or something. So the next night, August 9th, he decided to go with them to show them how to do it right. They went to the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, a middle-aged couple who ran a chain of grocery stores. Manson went inside, tied them up, then left, and sent the others in to kill them, which they did, brutally. And they wrote more messages in blood: "Death to pigs," "Rise," and "Helter Skelter," they misspelled it, on the walls. 2 nights, 7 people died. For absolutely no reason except the delusional apocalyptic fantasies of a failed musician and career criminal. And now here's what's crazy. The police didn't connect the murders right away. The Tate murders and the LaBianca murders were being investigated by different departments. And at first, there were all these theories about drug deals gone wrong, about celebrity excess, about organized crime. It wasn't until months later, when Susan Atkins was arrested on unrelated charges and bragged about the murders to her cellmate, that the case broke open. The cellmate went to the police, and that's when everything unraveled. The trial was a circus. Manson and the girls who'd been arrested with him showed up with X's carved into their foreheads. They sang in the courthouse. They threatened the judge. Manson's followers, who weren't in jail, held vigils outside, camping on the courthouse lawn. The media went absolutely insane with this story. See, it had everything: Hollywood, celebrities, sex, drugs, cults, violence. It was like someone had designed it specifically to capture the American imagination and not let go. And it worked. We're still talking about it, aren't we? More than 50 years later. Linda Kasabian testified against the others in exchange for immunity. Her testimony was devastating, detailed, and credible. Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, who'd participated in the LaBianca murders, were all convicted. Manson himself was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, even though he hadn't personally killed anyone. They were all initially sentenced to death, but when California temporarily abolished the death penalty in 1972, their sentences were commuted to life in prison. Charles Manson died in prison in 2017 at age 83. Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten are still in prison, though Van Houten was actually granted parole in 2023 after being denied something like 20 times. Susan Atkins died of brain cancer in prison in 2009. So why does this case still fascinate us? Why am I making this video? Why are you watching it? I think it's because the Manson murders represent something bigger than just a crime. They represent the death of the 60s, the end of the peace and love era, the moment when America realized that the counterculture could be just as dangerous and violent as the establishment it was rebelling against. Before August 1969, people in places like Los Angeles left their doors unlocked. They trusted strangers. They believed in the goodness of humanity, or at least they wanted to. After the Manson murders, that changed. Suddenly, the hippie on the street corner wasn't a harmless dreamer. He was a potential threat. Communes weren't utopian experiments. They were breeding grounds for cults and violence. The murders happened just a few days before Woodstock, that massive celebration of peace and music and community. And the contrast between those two events, happening almost simultaneously, perfectly captures the split in American culture at that moment. But here's what really gets me. What really frustrates me about how this story gets told. We focus so much on Manson, on his charisma, and his manipulation, and his evil, that we forget about the victims. We forget that Sharon Tate was a real person with dreams and plans and a baby on the way. We forget that Jay Sebring was a talented artist who'd revolutionized men's hairstyling. We forget that Abigail Folger was an heiress who used her privilege to work for social causes. We forget that Wojciech Frykowski was a writer and filmmaker. We forget that Stephen Parent was just an 18-year-old kid selling clocks and radios to make money for college. We forget that Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were just ordinary people running a business and living their lives. They all had families, friends, futures, and those were stolen from them in the most brutal way possible by people who'd convinced themselves they were doing something important, something revolutionary. And you know what else pisses me off? The way the Manson family members have been treated like celebrities over the years. The interviews, the documentaries, the TV movies, the endless fascination with them. Susan Atkins sold her story to publishers. Manson got fan mail in prison, marriage proposals. These people murdered 7 human beings in cold blood, and we've rewarded them with attention and notoriety. Meanwhile, Sharon Tate's mother, Doris Tate, spent the rest of her life attending parole hearings for the killers, making sure they stayed in prison. She became a victims' rights advocate, helped create laws that allowed victims' families to make statements at parole hearings. She died in 1992, but her daughter Deborah has continued the work. That's the real story here, not Manson's philosophies or the family's dynamics or the tabloid details of the crime scenes. The real story is what these murders took from the world and how the people left behind had to find a way to keep living in the aftermath. Roman Polanski lost his wife and unborn child. He never really recovered. He made some brilliant films after this, yeah, but there's a darkness in his later work that wasn't there before. And his own life became increasingly controversial and complicated in ways that I'm not going to get into here because that's a whole other thing. The victims' families had to live with the knowledge that their loved ones' final moments were filled with terror and pain. That's a burden that doesn't go away, no matter how much time passes. Look, I know this has been heavy. I know this isn't the kind of video you watch to relax or be entertained, but I think it's important, especially now, in an age where we're constantly bombarded with true crime content that treats real tragedies like entertainment, to remember that these were real people. The Manson murders weren't a Netflix series. They weren't a cautionary tale about drugs or cults or the 60s. They were a tragedy, pure and simple. 7 people died because a manipulative sociopath convinced a group of vulnerable young people that murder could start a revolution. And the scariest part? It could happen again. Different people, different ideology, different circumstances, but the basic dynamics, the manipulation, the isolation, the gradual escalation from fringe beliefs to violent action, that's always going to be a threat, as long as there are people willing to exploit others' vulnerabilities. So what do we do with that? How do we remember this case in a way that honors the victims and prevents future tragedies? I don't have a perfect answer, but I think it starts with telling the truth, the whole truth, not the sanitized Hollywood version or the sensationalized tabloid version, but the real, complicated, uncomfortable truth about what happened on those 2 nights in August 1969. Sharon Tate should be remembered for more than how she died. She should be remembered for how she lived. As a talented actress, a devoted friend, a loving wife, an expectant mother. Same for all the other victims. And the Manson family members? They should be remembered as what they were. Not mysterious or fascinating or revolutionary, but simply as people who made terrible choices, who allowed themselves to be manipulated into committing unspeakable acts, and who destroyed countless lives in the process. That's the story. That's what happened. And more than 50 years later, we're still trying to make sense of it. I'm still trying to understand how people could do this to each other. Still mourning what was lost on those 2 terrible nights in Los Angeles. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching. If you want more deep-dive true crime stories told with detail and respect, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.